At 7 o'clock on January 24, 1945, First Lieutenant Garland Connor stood inside the frozen command post of the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, watching the tree line 400 yards ahead of him disappear under German artillery fire. Shells burst among the bare winter trees. Branches shattered. Frozen earth exploded upward in violent geysers of dirt and snow. Connor was 25 years old, an intelligence officer who had returned to the front line only 2 days earlier after weeks in a military hospital. Several of his wounds were still healing. His arm ached constantly in the cold. Outside, the temperature hovered near 10 degrees below zero. The Germans were preparing a counterattack. Across the woods in front of the American positions, the German 19th Army had assembled 600 infantry soldiers and 6 Mark VI Tiger tanks. Their objective was simple: break through the American lines near the small village of Hausen, France, and reopen the shrinking Colmar Pocket, the last large area of German-controlled territory remaining in France. Connor did not look like a soldier who had survived 4 years of war. He was 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighing barely 120 pounds, a thin tobacco farmer from Clinton County, Kentucky. He had never finished high school. The nearest school had been 15 miles from his family's farm, and most of his childhood had been spent working in the fields instead of studying. He had enlisted in the U.S. Army in March 1941, months before America entered the war. Since then, he had fought through 10 major campaigns, participated in 4 amphibious assault landings, and been wounded 7 separate times. The last wound had nearly killed him. Doctors had ordered him to remain in the hospital. Connor had ignored them. He returned to his battalion anyway. Now he stood in a dim command post dug into frozen ground while artillery shells continued to hammer the forest outside. The Colmar Pocket had become one of the most brutal battlefields in Western Europe. For months, German forces had clung to this 850-square-mile pocket of frozen farmland and forests west of the Rhine River. Repeated Allied attempts to destroy the pocket had failed. Thousands of soldiers had died trying to push the Germans back across the river. At the beginning of January 1945, Hitler launched Operation Nordwind, the final German offensive on the Western Front. The attack struck American lines in Alsace while the Battle of the Bulge still raged hundreds of miles to the north. The offensive ultimately failed, but the Germans inside the Colmar Pocket were still there, and they were desperate. For 18 days, Connor's battalion had held the same stretch of frozen front line. German patrols probed the American defenses every night. Snipers fired from the woods. Artillery struck without warning. In just 2 weeks, the battalion had lost 43 men. Most of them had died without ever seeing the enemy. Connor's official job was intelligence officer. His work normally involved gathering patrol reports, interrogating prisoners, analyzing enemy movements, and marking positions on maps. Intelligence officers usually remained safely behind the front line. They worked with paper and radios. They did not lead attacks. But Garland Connor had never been the kind of officer who stayed safely behind a desk. During the war, he had already earned 4 Silver Stars, one of the highest American decorations for valor in combat. October 1943 in Italy, January 1944 at Anzio, September 1944 in France, and another in early 1945. Each medal represented a moment when Connor had ignored orders to remain behind the lines and had instead moved forward to save other soldiers. Within the battalion, everyone knew his reputation. When the situation became desperate, Connor moved toward the danger. At 7:15, the German artillery barrage intensified. Shells walked across the American positions in precise patterns. Trees shattered like matchsticks. Frozen soil erupted into the air. The roar of exploding artillery rolled continuously across the forest. The barrage lasted 12 minutes. Then it stopped. For several seconds, the battlefield became eerily silent. Then came a new sound. Tank engines. A runner burst into the command post. Germans advancing. The young soldier struggled to catch his breath. 6 Tigers, infantry behind them, hundreds of them moving through the woods. The battalion commander studied the map spread across the table. If the Tiger tanks reached the American foxholes, the battalion would be destroyed. The massive German tanks could simply roll over the defensive line. There were no American tanks nearby, no tank destroyers, no anti-tank guns strong enough to stop 6 Tigers. Only one weapon could halt the attack. Artillery. But artillery required a forward observer, someone close enough to the battlefield to see the enemy advance and adjust the shells. The problem was simple. The forward observation post had been destroyed during the barrage. The observers were dead. From inside the command post, the thick forest blocked all visibility. No one could see the German attack developing through the trees. Without an observer, the artillery would fire blind. Connor studied the map for several seconds. The German attack was coming through a section of woods roughly 400 yards from the command post. To observe it, someone would have to cross 400 yards of open ground under artillery fire and then remain exposed ahead of the American lines while 6 Tiger tanks and hundreds of German infantry advanced directly toward them. Connor reached down and picked up a field telephone. Next to it was a spool of 400 yards of communication wire. He looked once at the battalion commander. Then he walked out into the snow. The artillery barrage had paused, but Connor knew it would start again soon. German artillery crews always resumed firing once their infantry began to advance. He stepped into the open field. Then he started running. 400 yards separated the command post from the front line. Connor carried the spool of wire in his left hand and the telephone receiver in his right. As he ran, the wire unspooled behind him across the frozen ground. His boots crashed through the thin crust of snow with every step. At 100 yards, the German artillery resumed firing. The first shells landed 40 yards to his left, then 30 yards to his right. German observers had spotted him, a lone American soldier running across open ground. The artillery began adjusting its aim. A shell slammed into a tree 70 yards ahead. The trunk exploded in a storm of splintered wood. Frozen branches rained down across the field. Connor kept running. Another shell landed 20 yards behind him. The concussion struck his back like a hammer and nearly knocked him off his feet. But he didn't fall. The wire kept unspooling. At 250 yards, another shell shattered a tree directly in his path. The trunk split apart and crashed across the snow. Connor vaulted over it without slowing. Shrapnel hissed into the frozen ground around him. Then another explosion. 15 yards to his left. A violent geyser of snow and dirt erupted into the air. The blast wave hammered Connor's ears until the world filled with a sharp, ringing sound. He could no longer hear his own breathing. At 300 yards, he reached the American front line. Soldiers crouched inside frozen foxholes stared in disbelief as he ran past them. An intelligence officer carrying a telephone wire, running toward the German attack. Connor didn't stop. 30 yards beyond the American foxholes, he found what he was looking for. A shallow ditch, barely 18 inches deep. It offered almost no protection, but it allowed him to lie low while still seeing through the trees toward the advancing Germans. Connor dropped into the ditch. He grabbed the telephone receiver and cranked the connection. For a moment, there was only static. Then a voice answered. The Artillery Fire Direction Center, 3 miles behind the front line. 12 American 105mm howitzers waited for coordinates. Connor gave his position. The officer on the other end confirmed. At that moment, Garland Connor became the eyes of the battalion's artillery. Everything depended on what he could see, and whether he could stay alive long enough to direct the guns. Connor slowly raised his head above the edge of the ditch. The German infantry were already 200 yards away. They moved in disciplined squads through the snow-covered trees, rifles ready, advancing in short rushes while other squads covered them. Professional soldiers. Behind them came the tanks. Connor counted 4 Tiger tanks pushing through the forest, crushing smaller trees as if they were saplings. 60-ton machines of steel and armor. Slow, methodical, unstoppable. Within minutes, they would break out of the tree line and roll straight toward the American foxholes. The German soldiers had not seen Connor yet. He lay alone in a shallow ditch 30 yards in front of his own line, with 600 enemy soldiers walking toward him. Connor lifted the telephone receiver. Fire mission. Enemy infantry advancing. Range 600 meters. Adjusting fire. The artillery officer acknowledged. The first shells would arrive in 40 seconds. If the Germans spotted him before then, they would kill him instantly. If the shells landed too close to his position, they would kill him as well. If the shells landed too far away, 600 German soldiers and 6 Tiger tanks would overrun the American battalion. Connor watched the enemy advance. He counted the seconds. 38, 39, 40. The sky screamed. 12 American artillery shells slammed into the forest 150 yards behind the German infantry. Too far. Connor grabbed the handset again. Drop 100. Fire for effect. The German soldiers kept advancing. They had not yet reacted to the shells, and they were getting closer. Artillery shells landing behind an advancing force was common. It meant the defenders were firing blind. The Germans understood this immediately. They had seen it many times before. When artillery overshot the target, it meant the observer could not see them clearly. The defenders were guessing, which meant the attackers still had time. But Garland Connor was not guessing. From his shallow ditch 30 yards in front of the American line, he could see everything. Every German squad moving between the trees. Every officer waving his men forward. Every step of the attack. He counted the seconds. 18 seconds after the first salvo, the second wave of shells arrived. This time they landed directly in the middle of the German infantry. The forest erupted. Trees shattered into splinters. Shrapnel tore through the air in screaming arcs. Men vanished in the explosions. Each 105mm shell carried nearly 14 pounds of high explosive. 12 shells. 168 pounds of explosives detonating at the same moment inside a tightly packed assault formation. The German line disintegrated. Soldiers were thrown to the ground. Others simply disappeared into smoke and flying debris. The advance stopped. Connor grabbed the handset again. Repeat fire. Same coordinates. Another salvo came crashing down. Then another. The American guns were now firing for effect. 12 howitzers, firing at maximum rate. 4 rounds per minute per gun. 48 shells every minute. All hammering the same patch of forest. The German infantry broke formation. Squads scattered. Some soldiers ran for cover behind trees. Others crawled through the snow, trying to escape the killing zone. The woods had become a furnace of exploding steel. But the Tiger tanks kept coming. Connor lifted his head again. Now he could see all 6 of them. The massive tanks burst through the tree line and rolled into the open ground beyond the forest. 60 tons of armored steel moving steadily through the snow. The artillery had barely touched them. A 105mm shell could damage a Tiger's tracks or optics, but it could not penetrate the armor. The tanks advanced in formation, 2 in front, 2 behind, 2 more following. Tank commanders stood half exposed in their open turrets, scanning the battlefield. One of the Tigers fired. The sound of the 88mm cannon cracked across the valley like thunder. The shell slammed into an American foxhole 300 yards to Connor's right. The explosion erased it. The men inside were gone instantly. Another Tiger fired. Another foxhole vanished. The tanks were now 300 yards from the American line. At their current pace, they would reach the foxholes in less than 4 minutes. If the Tigers crossed the defensive line, the battalion would collapse. Tanks behind the American positions would cause chaos. Soldiers would panic. Units would break. Men would run. And once a retreat began, the Germans would chase them through the snow and destroy the entire battalion. Connor spoke into the telephone. Enemy armor advancing. Range 250 meters. Adjust fire onto the tanks. The problem was precision. Artillery was never meant to destroy tanks. It was designed to saturate large areas, killing infantry, destroying buildings, and cutting communication lines. Tanks were small targets. Fast targets. Heavily armored targets. The next artillery salvo fell around the Tigers. One shell exploded 10 yards in front of the lead tank. The Tiger drove straight through the blast. Another shell burst behind the formation. The tanks kept advancing. Their commanders knew American artillery alone could not stop them. They intended to drive straight through the barrage. Connor needed the shells closer. Drop 50. Fire for effect. The next salvo landed directly among the tanks. One shell struck the lead Tiger's right track. The massive steel link shattered. The tank lurched sideways and ground to a halt. Immobilized, but still deadly. The turret swung toward the American lines. The 88mm gun was still operational. Another shell detonated on the rear deck of a second Tiger. Smoke began pouring from the engine compartment. The crew might abandon the tank, or they might keep fighting. Either way, a disabled Tiger with a working gun was still a fortress. For more Tigers kept moving forward. Then Connor saw something worse. The tanks were changing direction. They were turning toward his position. The German commanders had spotted him. They had seen the telephone wire trailing across the snow. They knew someone out there was directing the American artillery, and they were coming to kill him. Connor looked around his ditch. 18 inches of frozen earth. That was all the protection he had. Not enough to stop an 88mm shell. Not enough to stop machine gun fire. Not enough to stop anything. The Tigers were now 150 yards away. Close enough that Connor could see the Bokenkreuz markings painted on the turrets. Close enough to see the tank commanders' faces. He lifted the handset again. Fire on my position. The artillery officer repeated the coordinates. Connor confirmed them. The officer hesitated. Calling artillery fire on your own location was almost unheard of. It meant friendly shells would land only yards away. It meant the observer might die. The officer asked him to confirm again. Connor confirmed. A third time. 40 seconds later, the first shells landed 30 yards in front of his ditch. The concussion slammed into him like a physical blow. The pressure crushed the air from his lungs. His vision blurred. Dirt and metal fragments screamed overhead. The sound was beyond thunder. It was the sound of the earth tearing itself apart. Connor stayed in the ditch. He kept the handset pressed to his ear. Drop 20. Repeat fire. The next shells landed 20 yards away, close enough that he could feel the heat from the explosions. Shrapnel ripped through the air 6 feet above his head. If he stood up, he would be torn apart. If the shells landed 10 yards closer, the ditch would not save him. The Tigers stopped advancing. The tank commanders slammed their hatches shut. Even Tiger crews did not want to sit outside their armor while artillery exploded almost on top of them. But the German infantry was rallying again. Connor could see them regrouping behind the tanks. Nearly 200 survivors forming new attack formations. They began using the Tigers as moving shields, advancing behind the massive armored vehicles. Mobile fortresses. The attack was still coming. Connor adjusted the fire again. He walked the artillery back and forth across the advancing Germans. Every time infantry tried to move forward, shells exploded among them. Every time a Tiger pushed ahead, Connor dropped artillery directly in front of it. Then one shell struck the turret of a Tiger tank. The armor held, but the impact jammed the turret ring. The turret could no longer rotate. The tank could only fire straight ahead. It was effectively useless. Another Tiger lost its second track. The crew abandoned it. 5 German soldiers scrambled from the hatches and ran toward the woods. American machine guns opened fire from the foxholes. 2 of them fell instantly. 3 disappeared into the trees. 3 Tigers remained operational, and the German infantry kept crawling forward. Connor could see their faces now, only 100 yards away. German soldiers moved through the snow, using shell craters as cover, creeping closer in small groups. They were trying to flank him. If they cut the telephone wire, the artillery would stop, and the attack would succeed. Connor had been lying in the ditch for 40 minutes. The temperature remained 10 degrees below zero. His hands were numb. His feet were numb. Frozen dirt filled his eyes and mouth every time a shell exploded nearby. The handset was coated in ice. Still, he kept calling fire. Then German artillery found him. A shell landed 15 yards to his right. Another 15 yards to his left. The Germans had him bracketed. Their observers had pinpointed the ditch. German shells and American shells were now landing inside the same 100-yard circle. Connor had become the center of 2 artillery barges at once. From the foxholes behind him, American soldiers watched in disbelief. A single lieutenant lying in the snow ahead of the line, calling artillery on himself. German shells trying to kill him. American shells exploding so close that fragments struck the edge of his ditch. And he did not move. He did not run. He stayed exactly where he was, adjusting fire, stopping the German attack. Then the Germans advanced again, now only 80 yards away, close enough for Connor to hear their officers shouting commands, close enough to hear the bolts sliding on their Mauser rifles. Connor lowered the artillery another 10 yards. The shells detonated 60 yards in front of him. The blast waves crushed into his body. Dirt cascaded into the ditch. Something slammed into his shoulder. Shrapnel, or a rock. He couldn't tell. His arm went numb. Connor switched the telephone receiver to his other hand. The German soldiers halted again, but they were not retreating. They were waiting. They knew the American observer was close, and if they found him, nothing would stop the attack. The 3 remaining Tiger tanks began moving again. They spread out across the frozen field, leaving roughly 50 yards between each vehicle, making themselves harder targets for the American artillery. The steel giants rolled forward slowly through the snow. 200 yards now separated them from the American foxholes. Connor watched them carefully. Then he lifted the handset. First the leftmost Tiger, then the center tank, then the right. He began splitting the artillery fire between all three targets. He wasn't trying to destroy them outright. That was almost impossible with 105mm shells. Instead, he was trying to slow them down, break their tracks, blind their optics, disrupt the attack. The next salvo screamed down from the sky. One shell slammed into the front glassy plate of the center Tiger. The armor held, but the impact rocked the 60-ton tank backward like a hammer blow. For a moment, the driver lost control. The Tiger lurched sideways. Its track caught on a frozen tree stump hidden beneath the snow. The track jammed. The tank stopped moving. 2 Tigers still remained, and the German infantry had now closed to within 50 yards. Connor raised his head slightly above the ditch. He could see the German officer leading the assault, 30 yards away. Young, probably no older than 22. A lieutenant. The officer gave silent hand signals to his men. No shouting now. They were too close. Sound would reveal their exact position. 20 German soldiers crawled behind him through the snow, spreading out in a skirmish line. They were preparing to rush the ditch from several directions at once. Connor spun the crank on the handset. Drop 5. Fire for effect. The shells landed 25 yards in front of him. The German officer vanished in the explosion. 4 soldiers with him disappeared as well. The survivors flattened themselves into the snow. They waited for the barrage to end. But Connor never let it end. He kept the shells falling. Adjusted left. Adjusted right, creating a wall of explosions between himself and the advancing Germans. The blasts were now so close that Connor could feel the heat on his face. Fragments struck the edge of the ditch. Some pieces landed inside. One jagged shard of steel slammed into the frozen ground 2 inches from his right hand. The last 2 Tigers kept advancing. They were now 150 yards from the American foxholes, close enough to bring their machine guns into play. The bow gunners opened fire. The MG-34 machine guns roared. Nearly 800 rounds per minute tore through the forest. Bullets chewed through tree trunks. Logs splintered. Snow and dirt erupted around the American foxholes. American soldiers fired back with rifles and machine guns. But rifle bullets could not harm a Tiger. Some American gunners tried aiming for the vision ports, hoping to blind the drivers. Others tried to hit exposed commanders. But the tanks kept rolling forward. Connor changed tactics. Request smoke. Mix with heat. Smoke shells and high-explosive rounds began landing around the tanks. White phosphorus smoke billowed into the freezing air. The battlefield disappeared inside a choking cloud. The Tigers vanished inside the smoke. But Connor could still hear them. The grinding of tracks. The roar of engines. The tanks were still moving. Then one of them burst out of the smoke cloud. Only 70 yards from the American foxholes. The 88mm cannon fired. An American machine gun position vanished in a violent explosion. 3 soldiers died instantly. Connor shouted coordinates into the handset. Danger close. Fire on that tank. The artillery officer hesitated. Those coordinates were within 50 yards of Connor's own position. The lethal radius of a 105 shell was roughly the same. Connor repeated the coordinates. The shells came down. One exploded 10 yards behind the tank. Another burst 15 yards to the left. Then a third detonated directly in front of the Tiger. The blast shattered the driver's vision block. The driver instantly lost sight. The tank swerved violently. Blind, it crashed into a crater and stopped. The crew tried to reverse. The tracks spun helplessly in the frozen mud. The tank was stuck. Only 1 Tiger remained operational, and the German infantry was advancing again. This time they approached from another direction, using the thick smoke for cover. Connor could no longer see them. He could only hear them. Voices. Boots crunching in the snow. The metallic click of Mauser rifle bolts being chambered. He estimated their position. Fire mission. Adjust left. Shells slammed into the smoke. He could not see the results, so he adjusted based on sound. Voices to his left. He shifted the artillery left. Movement to his right. He shifted again. Then the artillery officer's voice came through the receiver. Battery ammunition low. 15 minutes remaining. 15 minutes. After that, the guns would fall silent, and the German assault would come again. Connor had now been lying in the ditch for over an hour. 40 minutes earlier, another soldier had joined him. a young private from the battalion intelligence section. The private had crawled forward from the American foxholes carrying extra telephone wire and a spare handset. He lay 5 feet from Connor now, scanning the smoke for movement. Suddenly the private whispered urgently. Movement. 15 yards. Connor gave coordinates. The shells landed 12 yards away. The blast wave lifted both men off the bottom of the ditch. Dirt and ice filled the air. The private screamed. Shrapnel had ripped through his left leg. Blood poured into the snow. Connor dragged him deeper into the ditch. The soldier was still conscious, still watching, still calling out German positions despite the wound. Then Connor saw the last Tiger. Only 60 yards from the American line, and German soldiers were now within 10 yards of the ditch. Connor lowered the artillery again. Drop 5. Fire immediately. The shells landed almost directly on top of him. The blast threw Connor completely off the ground. His body slammed back into the frozen earth. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then the ringing began in his ears. A high-pitched scream that drowned out everything else. But the German soldiers who had been 10 yards away were gone. Connor grabbed the handset again. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. The artillery officer's voice sounded distant, like it came from another world. Connor focused on the last Tiger. The tank was now 40 yards from the American foxholes, close enough to destroy the defenses one by one. The commander stood in the open hatch scanning the American line, choosing his next target. Connor gave the final coordinates. Maximum concentration. All guns. 12 shells arrived at once. The Tiger vanished inside a storm of explosions. When the smoke cleared, the tank was still there. But it wasn't moving. The driver's optics were destroyed. The crew had slammed the hatch shut. The tank was blind and immobilized. Then the hatch opened. 5 German tankers climbed out and ran for the tree line. American rifles fired from the foxholes. 3 of them fell. 2 disappeared into the woods. All 6 Tiger tanks had now been destroyed or abandoned. The armored assault had failed, but the German infantry still remained. Hundreds of experienced soldiers scattered across the forest. They continued fighting. Connor shifted the artillery barrage again. Shells marched across the tree line, across shell craters, across every approach where German troops might advance. Then the artillery officer spoke again. 10 minutes ammunition remaining. Moments later, the battalion commander came onto the radio net. His voice was urgent. Connor, withdraw immediately. Return to the line. Artillery will cover your movement. Connor looked across the battlefield. German soldiers were still hiding in the woods, still waiting, still searching for him. If he left now, the artillery would stop, and the attack might begin again. Connor picked up the handset and gave one final fire adjustment. The barrage continued, and the German counterattack finally began to collapse. Garland Connor did not leave the ditch. From where he lay in the frozen earth, he could see the entire battlefield. Every German movement, every attempt to rally, every effort to reorganize for another assault. If he withdrew now, the American artillery would lose its forward observer. The guns would fire blind, and the German survivors might gather themselves for one final push. Connor refused to allow that. Beside him, the wounded private remained conscious. His leg had stopped bleeding, not because the wound had healed, but because the intense cold had frozen the blood. The young soldier kept his rifle ready. If German soldiers rushed the ditch, he would fight. Nearly 2 hours had passed since Connor left the command post. Then German artillery returned. The enemy observers had finally pinpointed his exact position. Shells began walking toward the ditch, 20 yards behind, then 15, then 10. The German gunners were adjusting carefully, professionally. Within another minute, the shells would land directly on top of him. Connor lifted the handset again. This time he called counter-battery fire. He gave the estimated coordinates of the German artillery batteries several miles behind their front line. Within seconds, the American howitzers shifted their aim. Shells began raining down on the German gun positions. The enemy artillery slowed, then stopped entirely. The counter-battery strike was working. Connor switched the artillery back onto the infantry. By now the sun had climbed higher. Full daylight filled the shattered forest, and the German soldiers could see the battlefield clearly. They could see the bodies. They could see the destroyed Tiger tanks. They could see the cratered forest. And they could see one American lieutenant lying in a shallow ditch with a telephone. One man calling down thunder. A final German squad tried one last attack. 8 soldiers burst from the trees, sprinting toward the ditch. They hoped to reach Connor before he could adjust the artillery. They ran 70 yards. They reached 40. Then the shells arrived. The entire squad vanished in the explosions. Bodies lifted into the air and disappeared in smoke and debris. No other German soldiers attempted to advance. The artillery officer's voice came through the handset again. 5 minutes of ammunition remaining. Connor continued directing the guns. Shells chased the retreating Germans through the woods. He made sure they kept moving, made sure they did not regroup, made sure they understood that any further attack on the battalion would end the same way. 3 hours after Connor had left the command post, the German counterattack collapsed completely. Still, Connor stayed in the ditch another 20 minutes, watching, listening, making certain the enemy would not try again. Finally, the telephone line went silent. The artillery battery had ceased firing. The guns needed to cool. The crews needed to reload. For the first time in hours, the battlefield grew quiet. Only the wind moved through the shattered trees, and distant voices of wounded men calling for help. German voices. 300 yards away. Connor slowly stood up. His legs barely held him. Hours in the frozen ground had locked his muscles. He took one step, then another. The wounded private tried to stand. He collapsed. Connor lifted him and supported his weight. Together they walked back toward the American line. Soldiers climbed out of their foxholes to meet them. They stared at the ditch, then at the battlefield beyond. The ground looked like the surface of the moon. Hundreds of craters overlapping each other. Burning wreckage. Pieces of Tiger tanks scattered across the snow. Bodies everywhere. The battalion commander met Connor at the line. He looked at the battlefield, then at Connor. He simply nodded. Medics carried the wounded private to the aid station. The soldier would survive. The wound had missed the bone. He would return to the unit in 6 weeks. Connor walked slowly back to the command post. A medic examined his shoulder. A small piece of shrapnel had embedded beneath the skin. Connor did not even remember when it had struck him. The medic removed it, bandaged the wound, told him he was lucky. Later that day, intelligence teams inspected the battlefield. They counted 53 confirmed German dead. Another 78 wounded left behind during the retreat. The real German losses were higher. Many casualties had been dragged back during the withdrawal. Total estimates exceeded 150 German soldiers killed or wounded. All 6 Tiger tanks were destroyed or abandoned. 4 immobilized by artillery. 2 abandoned after catastrophic track damage. American casualties were far lighter. 11 killed. 23 wounded. Most of them had died before Connor reached the ditch. Once the artillery began landing accurately, American losses stopped. The battalion remained on the line for another 8 days. The Germans never attacked again. On February 10, 1945, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commander of the U.S. 7th Army, arrived personally at the battalion. He presented Garland Connor with the Distinguished Service Cross. The citation described Connor's actions. His advance under artillery fire. 3 hours directing artillery from an exposed position. His decision to call fire on his own location when the enemy closed within yards. The battalion commander had recommended him for the Medal of Honor. But the paperwork moved slowly. Connor was being sent home. He had fought 28 consecutive months in combat. He had been wounded 7 times. The Army ordered him back to the United States. On March 15, 1945, he left France. 3 weeks later, he arrived in New York. He was discharged that summer. The war in Europe ended while he was already home. His hometown of Albany, Kentucky, held a parade in his honor. At the ceremony, the famous World War I hero Alvin York spoke. York understood exactly what Connor had done. During that celebration, Connor met a young woman named Pauline Wells. He married her 2 months later. They built a quiet life on a farm. No electricity, no running water, just tobacco, corn, and the land his family had worked for generations. Connor never spoke about the war. His medals stayed hidden inside a cardboard box in the back of a closet. For more than 50 years, the story remained buried. Then in 1996, a researcher opened that box. He read the citations and realized something extraordinary. Garland Connor should have received the Medal of Honor. The fight to correct the record lasted decades. Connor died in 1998, believing the award would never come. But his wife Pauline refused to give up. 20 years later, in 2018, the United States finally corrected its mistake. On June 26, 2018, in the White House East Room, the president presented the Medal of Honor to Pauline Connor. She was 89 years old. It had taken 73 years for the nation to recognize what one man had done in a frozen ditch in France. A small farmer from Kentucky, lying alone in the snow, calling artillery onto his own position, and stopping an entire German armored assault.